Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Wow, Chris, you were right. This was kind of hard to read. So if I stumble, you know why. I'm going to start off my talk with a very important question. Who here has seen Prince of Egypt?
Oh, yeah.
Show of hands.
Yes.
I don't know if my slide's working. But
There you go.
there we go. Well, if you haven't seen it, you need to. It's a phenomenal movie, a labor of love and masterpiece of animation and music. Prince of Egypt was one of my favorite movies when I was growing up. I've always found the story of Moses to be very compelling. In a way, it had a lot in common with the adventure novels that I devoured at a breakneck speed. An Egyptian prince discovers he's actually a member of an oppressed people group and is called by God to lead them to freedom, performing miracles such as summoning plagues and parting the sea. But the story is so much more than the movie I grew up loving. It tells us something important about God's love of justice and offers us a striking example of how social movements are formed. It has long been a pillar in both Black churches and liberation theology. Moses' story was used as a symbol for the Underground Railroad, and hymns and verses from it were used as codes to directly lead to the liberation of enslaved Black Americans. All of this is to say, I am by no means the first person to read his story in this way. Every story included in the Bible is intentional and provides us with important insight about God. That one of the earliest and longest chapters featured in it centers liberation and the lengths that God goes not only to liberate oppressed people, but build an equitable society afterwards is meaningful. It tells us one of God's most important values and shows us a biblical figure that undergoes a whole journey into becoming involved with social justice. Now, Moses' life almost ends the moment it begins. According to Exodus 1, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, fears the growth of the Hebrew people, whom he is currently enslaved, so he orders the Hebrew midwives to kill every male child that is born. But Moses' mother hides him and then comes up with a plan. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it along the reeds on the bank of the river. Notice she didn't send Moses floating down the river like they did in Prince of Egypt. How many of you grew up picturing baby Moses dangerously skirting the rapids? I know I certainly did. Yeah. Books and movies must like to tell the story that way because it makes it look more exciting. But when you think about it, it also makes Moses' mother look terrible. I want to note that he was placed safely on the bank of the river, among the reeds, somewhere he would be secure. But more importantly for his mother's plans, Moses is placed somewhere that the Pharaoh's daughter frequents, and his sister is hidden nearby to watch, as shown in the following lines. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. While it may have been divine providence that Pharaoh's daughter happened to walk past this part of the river, I would argue that this was an intentional act on the part of Moses' mother and sister. They recognized that with Pharaoh having ordered the deaths of any Hebrew boys, the safest place for him would be with someone who could shield him from Pharaoh's orders. With this reading, it was a carefully planned act of resistance and survival. They knew that where the Egyptian woman bathed, possibly even Pharaoh's own house. In order to read Moses' story through the lens of social justice, we need to understand that there were small acts of resistance and resilience that the Israelites, even those with the lowest status, such as young enslaved women, were taking. Even the side characters in the story are not passive and are protected and shown favor by God. Let's take a look to see how it worked for them. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. I think that this passage is a brilliant example of how his mother and sister resisted the systems in place in order to protect him. Think about it. Not only do they save Moses' life, they get him adopted into the most powerful household in the land. They arrange it so they can still care for him as one of their own, and they get paid to do so by the daughter of the very man who is ordering the execution of Hebrew boys. It's an amazing inversion of the power structure. Even in this relatively small passage, we can see the resistance, resilience, and intentionality in keeping Moses safe. I also want to note that this section contradicts the Prince of Egypt version, in which Moses is raised by Egyptians and thinks of himself as an Egyptian. Biblical scholars have debated when Moses identified with the Hebrews and thought of himself as a Hebrew. However, one thing that this passage sheds light on is that Moses was, for however small or long a time in his childhood, raised by Hebrew women and had exposure to their culture. He may have also formed close relationships with his sister, mother, and other Hebrew women in the community. In whatever case, the next passage we see is when Moses is older. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. By this point, Moses may have identified as a Hebrew. At the very least, we see him strongly empathizing with them. The words and phrases in this text show a sense of solidarity between him and the Hebrews, claiming them as his people and his kinsfolk, and notes how he saw their forced labor. Moses has a strong sense of justice and anger at the abuse of the Hebrews. I also want to note how intentional and premeditated the murder is. He looks this way and that for witnesses, and when there are none, he kills the Egyptian and then hides his body in the sand. There's no accident, nor is he blinded by anger. Here, Moses is cold, calculating, and shows solidarity with the plight of the enslaved Israelites. This also diverges from the stories we may have heard, or the one presented in the Prince of Egypt, in which the killing was accidental. It shows his fury and frustration at the systemic suffering he is witnessing, and we see him lash out in a calculated manner. However, Moses' killing of the Egyptian is eventually found out when he has to flee to the desert in Midian, because as it tells us in Exodus 2:15, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Moses then spent 40 years in the desert. He builds a family and starts a new life. We don't know how he feels about his early life, the people he left behind, or the murder he committed, but he doesn't seem to have any intention of ever going back to Egypt. But even though Moses has left his people behind, God is still watching the Israelites. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. This passage is essential to reading the story through the lens of social justice. While it is important that Moses is angered by the enslavement of the Hebrews, more importantly, God sees them. Even when Moses is not present, God is. Their cries may have even just been cries of pain instead of cries out to God directly, but God hears it all the same. Here, God recognizes this injustice and aligns himself with their burdens and eventual liberation. And, somewhat surprisingly, God goes and gets Moses, this conflicted Hebrew man who ran for his life, and brings him back into the story. God famously appears to Moses as a burning bush on Mount Sinai and tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and convince him to let the Israelites go. God says, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land to a land flowing with milk and honey. But Moses doesn't want to do it. Consider how much he's changed from that angry young man who's willing to kill to protect one of his own people from abuse. He's reluctant even when God imbues Moses with God's powers in his staff and instructs Moses to bargain with Pharaoh. Moses protests, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Here, it's not clear if this is due to a speech impediment, a condition such as Tourette's, speech difficulties after a stroke, social anxiety, or something else. But God insists that Moses is the one to do this, and overcomes Moses' objections by pairing him with his brother Aaron, who is well-spoken. I love how empowering this is, especially if we read it as Moses having some form of disability. Moses' ability to speak does not discount him from being the leader on the path to liberation, and actually provides an opportunity for him to collaborate with other valued members of the community. It helps him to share leadership of the movement, something essential to keeping any social movement alive and reducing burnout. And there's one other detail here that I personally found really surprising. The Bible tells us that Moses is 80 years old, and Aaron is 83 when they go to speak to Pharaoh. Think of how wild that is, that Moses becomes the leader of his people so late in life. So Moses returns to Egypt, and with Aaron's help demands that Pharaoh let the Hebrew people go. Pharaoh does not listen, and Moses demonstrates God's powers through turning his staff into a snake, turning the Nile River to blood, and eventually unleashing 9 other plagues upon Egypt. After the last and most deadly plague, Pharaoh agrees to free the Israelites, and Moses leads them out of Egypt. But when they leave Egypt, the Pharaoh decides to pursue them, leading to a frantic chase and perhaps one of the most famous parts of Moses' story, the parting of the Red Sea. Moses is able to successfully get the Israelites out of Egypt, and when the oceans fall back down, it drowns the pursuing Egyptian army. Moses has successfully liberated his people from Egypt, but his story doesn't end there. Moses receives the 10 Commandments from God and leads the Israelites in the wilderness for another 40 years, and finally brings them to the border of the Promised Land before he dies. This part of his life I find especially interesting. At this point, Moses met his initial goal of freeing his people, but he recognizes that to reach true liberation, they can't stop there. He also realizes that the future he envisions for them in the Promised Land is not attainable within his lifetime. Moses, already in his 80s, knows that he will not make it to the Promised Land. To me, this parallels so many early leaders of social movements who knew, even as they made great strides for their cause, that they wouldn't ever see the finish line or the future of full liberation that they were building towards. But even knowing this, Moses wants to ensure the future of his people. He trains and mentors Joshua to lead them to the Promised Land until he passes away. Stanford sociologist Douglas McAdam offers a framework for understanding and building social movements called political process theory, based on his study of the civil rights movement. In his book, Political Process and the Development of Black Insurgency, he writes that there are 3 essential elements for successful social movement formation: insurgent consciousness, organizational strength, and political opportunities. Let's look more closely at Moses' story in light of McAdam's theory. Insurgent consciousness occurs when there's a large disparity between groups, and a collective sense of injustice develops within the marginalized group. Mistreatment by an unjust system motivates members of the group to form a social movement to change the system as a whole. In Moses' story, we see this as Moses' mother and sister engage in acts of resistance, as Moses fights against one of the Egyptian overseers, as the people cry out to God for help, and later as they join together with Moses as a community to form a liberation movement. The second element of political process theory, organizational strength, argues that to be successful, social movements must have strong and efficient leadership and sufficient resources. Within Moses' story, we see strong leadership through both Moses and Aaron, and with each fulfilling vital roles to the movement, and serving as representatives of God, who is their ultimate leader, and who provides the resources that make their liberation possible. The final element in political process theory is political opportunities. McAdam argues that for a social movement to be successful, it must take advantage of moments of vulnerability in the existing system, such as infighting among the elites, decline in repression, and members of the opposed group gaining positions of political power. One important aspect of Moses' story is that he's someone from a marginalized group who was adopted by the oppressing class. Growing up in Pharaoh's house, Moses was exposed to the inner workings of the system and could observe court politics. Moses received an education, formal or informal, about how the system worked and the manners in which people expressed themselves. Furthermore, simply by being able to claim he was a member of Pharaoh's house, he was more likely to secure an audience with Pharaoh. One could also argue that God's willingness to intervene with greater power than that of Pharaoh represents an opportune moment of vulnerability in which Moses and his people can act. I love how this foundational biblical passage gives us such a striking example of God being on the side of justice, and it does so in a way that is recognizable in modern justice movements. It's extraordinary, and it gives me a lot of hope. And Moses is such an interesting figure. He's flawed, conflicted, and ordinary, and just trying to navigate his complicated life and identities in a system where he experiences both oppression and privilege. And yet, he's able to play this critical role in the deliverance of his people. Over the course of his life, we see how his involvement and roles shift over time. What I love about Moses' story is how nonlinear it is. We see his full development and involvement in a social movement across his lifespan, from his early years within the system to his individual frustration, exile, the liberation of his people, and preparing them for what comes next. I also really love that he didn't become a powerful political leader until he was much older, and that due to his difficulty with speaking, he would not be an obvious choice. To me, it's very hopeful and shows that it's never too late and that any of us can be an important part of something. While I'm still on my own journey with social justice, CCF has always been a space for me to think more deeply about the intersection of justice and faith. The types of conversations that we have within this space have helped me reconcile my personal beliefs about what our world should look like with God's views and discover that there's a lot of overlap. I'm really proud to be part of a community like this, one that's so radically welcoming and tackles relevant and difficult questions. Sometimes social justice can feel like a very nebulous concept. There are so many different aspects of it, we might wonder how to integrate it into our communities and our lives. But I think talking about it and providing opportunities for engagement is really important. Talks like this one, or the talk that Chris gave last week, being welcoming to a variety of identities, being queer-affirming, and investigating Christianity's complicated legacy are all important to creating a strong, justice-oriented space. And through specific actions, from working with the Prison Library Project and community gardens, raising mutual aid funds, remaining informed and engaged, providing support to marginalized identities, or even just the conversations we have after fellowship, we can continue to take more steps towards justice together. At this point, I've talked for a long time, and I want to ask you guys some questions. Quietly read through them and think to yourself. And when you're ready, turn to a neighbor and share your thoughts. Okay, so it seems like everyone's really engaged and has had some really good conversations. And at this point, I want to bring us back together and invite anyone who wants to share their thoughts with the group. It could be anything. It's not a pop quiz or you have to be graded on it. Daniel, go right ahead.
One of the things I think is really powerful about Moses as a character is that he's very human, very vulnerable, and he experiences the same kinds of emotions we do. There's a very powerful passage, and I wish I could recall it perfectly, but I can't, where Moses says to God, I've carried these people, I've given birth to them, right? And I've nursed them. And this is so hard, God. It's so hard. I can't do it anymore. And if you really love me, kill me now. So I don't have to keep doing this. And God doesn't, obviously. Moses is scared. And yes, he was this great figure who, called down the wrath of God on Pharaoh and his army. But he really suffered. And he was very much human.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what makes his story so compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, Moses is a fascinating character. I highly recommend reading through his passages because the journey he goes through. And I love that you bring up his vulnerability and how he despairs. And yes, he does all these amazing things, but he's also the ordinary person who, when God said, "You're going to lead my people to freedom," he said, no, I know you're all knowing, but that's not me. I can't do that. So he's almost like a reluctant leader in that. And that's another really interesting aspect. Yeah, it's human.
Actually, to add on to that, I forget where I heard it, but something along the lines of the best leaders tend to be not the ones to jump out on opportunity the most, but they tend to be like reluctant and can't be convinced. Oh, it was I think it was one of the Greeks. Yeah, yeah, it was one of the Greeks who were like, oh, it was Plato, and then like you feel like the philosopher king.
Yeah.
The philosopher has to be convinced to like come back from outside the cave into back of the cave.
I love the Plato reference. Also, speaking of reluctant leaders, you should all consider leadership. No, but that's such a good point. And I love just conversations that we can have about this. And that, Moses was not chomping at the bit to be a leader. It was kind of, he was called to it by God and he did it well, but it was a really difficult thing for him. And I think that a lot of leaders of social movements have said, like, it's really difficult and it's, it can cause a lot of burnout. Of course, it's very fulfilling, but it's a big undertaking. And I love highlighting that about him. Anyone else have thoughts? Could be anything. Things that surprised you, what you identify with. Oh, okay. You can rock, paper, scissors. Okay.
Go.
Yesenia, you go.
I think like through my little like political advocacy activist journey or whatever you call it, like I just like again like recalling what you said about like the non-linearness of Moses' journey and like not everything has to be like one step after another and like a lot of what life is just like exploring yourself and helping other people, which is a very like hard thing to do, and like helping other people explore themselves as well.
Yeah.
And it's just like a fun, interesting journey. It doesn't have to be like a single line or anything like that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Because he takes actions, like, I wouldn't recommend killing someone, but he does that. He's really upset. And then he just goes off to the desert for 40 years. And then gets called back. So I love how, non-linear it is. And I think that so many of us, it's not like, oh, I'm suddenly like a superstar champion of justice and equity. It's kind of a non-linear journey. Hey.
Kind of like on what you said, well, a couple of points. That, and then also like what you identify with about Moses' journey. I thought it was interesting, like the whole like concept of like being both like oppressed and privileged, and then how that ties into social justice. I know personally for me, like growing up being like very low income, and then now going to like an $80,000 college, and like part of me wants to just leave behind the hardship and kind of just be like, okay, like I made it out, like go forward with my life, like I don't know, suburbia, I don't know, whatever like future that looks like. But then part of me is like, okay, but like what about helping all the people who are like also in my situation, like also are coming from the cities that I came from. And then it's like, but what if I don't have the energy? Because like I don't honestly feel like I have the energy to be like social justice champion activist right now. But like not Jesus. Well, yes, Jesus, but like Moses, like his life wasn't linear, and so it kind of gives me like, okay, maybe right now that's not what I'm being called to do, but it doesn't mean that like I can't do that in the future. And just because I need to take like a breath and like breathe and like heal, so to speak, it doesn't mean that it's like wrong to have time to do that, because it doesn't mean you can't do that later. And so I thought that was like an interesting thought process that was provoked from your wonderful talk.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think, based upon Moses' trajectory, you have like 40 years to go before having to worry about any of that.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. Okay, you can go to the desert and it'll be okay.
She hasn't killed anybody yet.
Yeah, maybe skip that stuff. Wow, you guys are all so insightful. I feel like I wish I could like invite everyone up to to talk with me.
We all get
because-
aligned.
Yeah, to the line, because so insightful. Thank you all for sharing. I love hearing your perspectives. But I'm sure we're all hungry, so I'm gonna pray us out, and we can have some delicious food. God, I thank you for this space, for the opportunity to have conversations like this. Thank you for everyone in this room and those who can't be here tonight. Thank you for your love and the ways in which you're always there for us. I pray that you're with us as we go into next week and you draw us closer as a community. And I pray that you're with us as we learn what justice looks like to you. Amen. Thank you all.